suggests, well, are we going to be talking that way about nanotechnology legacies in 50 years or 100 years or whenever those epidemiological results start to come in? I can't help but wonder, right? There are material legacies in the nuclear realm. There are discursive legacies, and tied to those discursive legacies, the way we talk about the world and the way we talk about decision making, the way we talk about guarding secrets, etc., have implications for democracy. They can be exclusionary, along with the principles of elitism and expertise that quite a few of you have discussed very astutely at these 2 days of sessions. Okay, and a final point from the nuclear domain that I want to fold into this is a favorite book of mine is by William Ray Arney, and the title is Experts in the Age of Systems, and he uses the Manhattan Project as a kind of case study to talk about how very brilliant scientists, who we would expect had a high degree of personal agency because they're very smart and in some ways they're very powerful figures, how they got sucked into a very large and amorphous system and their agency was highly constrained as they became part of that system. So I think there are cautionary lessons to be learned there that may apply to the realm of nano as well. And on the topic of agency and being part of a system, I was in the Netherlands last week at the Society for Social Studies of Science conference, and I did go to a session where a fellow from the European Commission sort of debuted this white paper, From the Ethics of Technology Toward an Ethics of Knowledge Policy and Knowledge Assessment. I don't know if anybody has heard about this, but it was kind of a preview at the 4S conference, and they're rolling out this paper at some other conference even as we speak this week. So I have a copy if anybody wants to take a glance at that, or you could look at it on the web. But the key idea here is he's suggesting that it's not so much about individual responsibility on the part of decision makers or members of the public who have to become invested and involved and educated and informed and participate in the process. We need some new vision of collective and shared responsibility, and it's rather vague about how we're going to get there, but I think it's an interesting principle to give some thought to. Okay. Regarding how we talk about technological risk, a favorite quote of mine from Niklas Luhmann, who also writes about risk from the kind of European sociological tradition, is this one. The rationalist tradition, says Luhmann, has been broadly accused of not seeing what it does not see. There's the perceptual filter or the deterministic screen principle once again. Dan, you know this next quote from Wittgenstein: the limits of my language are the limits of my world. How we talk about nano and how we talk about nano risk, and the very choice we make to think of nano in terms of risk and all the baggage that comes with that becomes a kind of deterministic screen. Again, from the nuclear realm, an interesting case study that has emerged in the past few years has to do with the vitrification or glassification plant at the Hanford site in Washington, where I was a member of the Citizen Advisory Board for 5 or 6 years. All the time that I was there, they were talking about building this plant in order to do something with the very dangerous high-level nuclear liquid waste that resides at Hanford. But for most of the time, they neglected the problem of seismology, and I believe I misspelled seismic. I apologize for that. But they didn't take seismology into account. My understanding is that one reason they didn't is because they didn't know how to calculate it. They didn't know how to model it, or they didn't think they had enough relevant data. So what do you do in a case like that? You just don't fold it into the analysis, right? Well, finally, in the year 2004, a seismic study was concluded, and they decided that the vitrification plant was at high risk for releasing large amounts of dangerous material in the case of a realistic scenario for an earthquake, right? As a result of that, the projected cost for the project has now doubled to $12 billion. That's talking about real money, even in the national budget terms, right? And the startup of the project has been delayed from 2011 to 2019. And I say that's the good news because that's better than actually just going along business as usual and having an accident someday on the side of the Columbia River, which services the entire Pacific Northwest, right? So it's good that they recognize the problem. Some people would say, well, this shows that the analytical deliberative system works, and it took us a while to get there, but we figured it out. But I'm not quite comfortable with that reading. I think we were dangerously close to making a big mistake. I also remember going to a Hanford Advisory Board meeting where I questioned people designing the vitrification plant about, well, what happens if upstream one of those big Columbia River dams breaks in the case of an earthquake, and all this water washes over the site where the vitrification plant is located? Can the plant sustain that kind of an event? What will the consequences be? And the guy told me very straightforwardly and very frankly, no, we don't calculate that because we don't know how to, right? I think we need to do better than simply ignore the problems that we can't calculate, all right? So what don't we see when we talk about risk in these terms? Well, here are some embedded premises that I think I've been seeing. First of all, a really strong emphasis on the individual cognition, a very psychologistic model of attitudes and values and agency, that they reside in individual people, and we can do some kind of studies, public opinion survey studies that aggregate that information, right? And that tells us what public opinion is all about. Well, in terms of the kind of systems principle from Arne that I mentioned earlier, I think we are increasingly being incorporated into or subsumed by a much more collective system of values and perceptions and attitudes. And that has implications for how we talk about the very concept of public opinion. Now, many people here have already sort of challenged the idea of the unitary monolithic public, and I think it's well recognized now that we have to deal instead with a multiplicity of publics, and there's a body of theory in communication and political science called counterpublics theory, which attempts to do that, and I think it does a reasonable job on starting to tackle that problem. But I think we may need to push it further than that. And it's not just about a multiplicity of publics, but it's multiplicity of publics that are conjoined and kind of organized by some larger system of globalization, or whatever we might choose to call it. Okay, a number of people here have challenged the idea, Pat challenged the idea especially, of deliberative democracy in the Habermasian tradition, or Dreisek's idea of deliberative democracy. So I think we need to perhaps consider other ways of envisioning the process of decision making that take a different view towards issues of power, perhaps a more Foucauldian view, the role of globalization, and I mean that in terms of economic capitalism globalization, but I also mean a kind of globalization and unification of values and of ways of seeing the world, the kind of hegemony of the Western rationalist tradition, which sort of suppresses or obscures or eclipses other valuable insights that other cultures potentially could give us. And of course, there's a well-known critique of that sort of Western rationalist perspective, which is attributed to Martin Heidegger, which says that increasingly science and technology have led us to view the world as a standing reserve, as a big oil tank that we can draw upon to meet our needs. And I worry that nano has some tendencies to view the world that way. Okay, 2 more slides. Some more embedded premises, right? And I've mentioned this before, calculability. There's been a strong emphasis on best science, and I'm certainly not disparaging the idea of best science. We need the best science we can get, but is the best science always good enough? Is it inclusive enough in terms of the dimensions of the problem that are relevant to us as a society or a collectivity? Does science capture all of the aspects of the problems that we are dealing with, right? So should we concentrate on best science, or should